What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm here to bring you the review of Hunter x Hunter episode 120 entitled Fake and Real. Alright, so this episode was actually pretty interesting. It wasn't just all action like I thought it would be. And I don't think this review should be that long, so let's just get into this. So before I get into the summary and analysis of this episode, let me just briefly explain why I think it's sort of ironic. Maybe that's not the right word, but perhaps ironic that this episode was so intriguing. It was because the more interesting fight was the one that had the least amount of action. If you sort of see what I'm saying. We got the brief skirmish between Yuppie versus Morel and Knuckle. But arguably the better fight was the psychological battle between Morel and Poof. And let me explain why that is. First of all, there was only two things that really happened in this episode. The first was that Hina and her assistant, I guess that's sort of her assistant, found and rescued Bezef. And this subplot really wasn't about much in this episode. If you remember, right when I came back and started reviewing Hunter x Hunter again, I mentioned that I haven't really watched or read Hunter x Hunter in almost a year, so I actually forgot what happened with this whole subplot. So since we didn't really get anything in this episode about where it might potentially go or what it might develop into, I'm pretty much, for anybody who's watching this for the first time, I'm pretty much precisely in your situation. Like, I don't remember anything that happened or what's going to happen in the future. But like I said, we didn't get really that much in this episode, but I do have some questions. At least one question. What the hell is Welfin doing following these people? Like, what has Welfin been doing this entire time since the attack on the palace started? I mean, all he's been doing is sneaking around, following people, being critical and suspicious of himself and other people. Like, what the hell is Welfin doing? When will this dude ever get some real burn? I mean, like, when will he ever do something important to the plot? Because right now, all it seems like this guy's doing is just not engaging in any fights, not doing anything, just sulking, sneaking around, and following people for no apparent reason. Not really sure what's going on with Welfin. Now, let's get to the second and more important thing that happened in this episode. Morel pretty much got his ass handed to him by by Poof. Not going to sugarcoat this at all. Poof tricked him. He did. The only thing that didn't happen to Morel is that he didn't get his ass beat. I mean, he got, but everything else that could possibly go wrong for Morel pretty much went wrong. Got tricked by Poof. Got his pipe taken, so he really can't use his nin abilities anymore. And just all around, he was just made to look like a fool. At least superficially. I will add that. At least superficially. And I want to take some time to analyze not just Morel's characterization, especially his internal characterization in this episode, but just the whole fight between Morel and Poof in general. So what happened in this fight? Not just in this episode, but generally, what happened in this fight between Morel and Poof? Pretty much only a handful of things happened. Morel activates Smoky Gel, which captures Poof. Poof makes a cocoon. Morel destroys the cocoon with his pipe. If you think about it, on the surface, that's pretty much the only thing that happened in this fight between Morel and Poof. But we know that a lot more was actually going on sort of underneath the surface of this whole confrontation between Morel and Poof. And this episode really captures what I was talking about at the end of my last review when I started to bring up all of the motifs that Togashi is raising in this arc and the way that he's developing this motif in sort of a variation of ways through the various characters in this arc. And again, this motif comes right back, which is the motif of the sort of psychological struggle and psychological battle that underlies the conflict between the hunters, who are sort of representatives of humans and humanity, and the Chimera ants. And we got a sort of perfect illustration of that psychological battle in this episode in the form of the fight between Morel and Poof. So we see that this is not just a sort of superficial external fight between the two characters, but there's sort of a deep psychological struggle that underlies that external fight, which, like I said, was really minuscule. And this was foreshadowed by Togashi maybe like 8 or 9 episodes ago, when Morel alluded to the fact that right before the mission started, and Morel alluded to the fact that he was only at maybe 30% of his full power, of his full operating capacity. And the narrator mentions this again in this episode. The narrator says, "From the start of the mission, Morel's condition was less than optimal. His exhaustion and impatience, combined with the extreme tension of the situation, clearly led him to the hasty decision to engage Poof in a battle of nerves." And what's interesting about this situation is that we have really an omniscient narrator, which is rather unusual in manga. Because generally in manga, you can draw out what's happening, so there really isn't a need for a narrator, at least an omniscient narrator, in terms of setting the stage, describing the scene, giving us a sort of description of what's happening in the action and the fight, and we really don't need the narrator to do those things. But Togashi makes a rather interesting use of the literary device of the omniscient narrator throughout this Chimera Ant arc. So the narrator specifically gives us insight into the character's internal psychological state. Generally in manga, since everything is drawn out and the audience gets to see everything objectively, and even those things that aren't objective, we assume that the characters are objective, at least in terms of their speech and their internal monologues. But here, Togashi is using the narrator to give us a very direct insight, omniscient insight, into the character's internal psychological state. Like I said, generally everything's drawn out for us in such a way that we can only infer the psychology of the characters. And that's very important, because there's a difference between making an inference about a character's psychological state through either their internal dialogue, monologue, and their actions and their relationships with other characters. There's a big difference between that and the narrator telling us, omnisciently giving us access to their internal psychological state. And notice what this does. It's very subtle the way this whole thing activates, because you might think that the narrator doesn't add anything to the story, that there really is no difference between the narrator telling us something and us inferring what's happening based on what we can objectively see and based on the internal monologue of the characters. But there's actually a big difference, and this fight really explores that difference. And we'll see that Togashi, through the use of the omniscient narrator, not only allows him to expand the scope of characterization of the characters, but it also allows him to expand the scope of the storytelling. So like I said, on the surface, only 3 things happen in this encounter between Morel and Poof. Morel activates Smoky Gel, which captures Poof. Poof makes a cocoon, and Morel destroys the cocoon. But in reality, much more is happening. So what's happening? At the beginning of the fight, we don't know exactly what's going on or why Poof has created this cocoon, but later on, through Poof's explanation, we see what's happened. And Poof explains this. He says, well, he doesn't say this exactly, but we infer this. Due to the limitations of Poof's ability, in other words, the fact that his main body, even when he separates himself into all these small particles, his main body can only maintain the size of a bee. And so he would not have been able to escape Smoky Jail. And as a result of him not being able to sort of diffuse his body or his small bodies through the smoke, he would have been much less powerful than he would have otherwise been with his main body. So due to that particular limitation of his ability, he has to devise a plan to account for this sort of physical limitation that he has. And his plan is based on causing Morel to be indecisive, to cause him some sort of psychological indecision in order to manipulate Morel and manipulate his actions in such a way that he'll be able to benefit and to get out of Smoky Jail. So he needs to confuse Morel in order to compromise Morel's decision making. And it would appear that Poof was successful in this because, after all, it looks like Morel made, based on his sort of compromised psychological state, that he made some somewhat suspect decisions and let Poof escape Smoky Jail. And not only that, but Poof stole his pipe so that now Morel can't even use any of his other nin abilities. So this is the interpretation of the event from Poof's perspective. However, due to the omniscient narrator, we know that this is only partially true. Because what does the narrator say? The narrator says that explains the situation in such a way that it's clear that yes, Morel made some bad decisions, but he also made some pretty good decisions. And one of the good decisions that he made, which is breaking that cocoon, led directly to Knuckle being saved. Because if Morel didn't do that, Knuckle probably would have been killed. He probably wouldn't have made it through his fight with Yuppie. And we see that it was the fact that Morel had other considerations that led him to destroy Poof's cocoon. Not just that he was making an error in judgment or being indecisive or acting entirely based on his compromised psychological state, but we know that there were other considerations that he was basing his actions on. And one of those was the fact that subconsciously he had realized that him and the group underestimated the strength of the Royal Guard. And he destroyed the cocoon to be able to lend support to his comrades if necessary. Because remember, he didn't know what the cocoon was about. And he could have sat there and gone back and forth and been indecisive and weighed the pros and cons of destroying the cocoon, which would have just paralyzed him. Or he could have destroyed the cocoon, which would have allowed him to assess the situation from a more broad perspective. In other words, not just considering his own fight with Poof, but also putting himself in a better position to assess the situation and lend support to his comrades if necessary, which was eventually what happened anyway. So, therefore, we have Poof's interpretation of the event, which is that Morel just made an error in judgment. And we have the narrator's interpretation of the event, which is that Morel made some good decisions and he made some bad decisions. And the good decision that he made led directly to Knuckle being saved from what would have almost certainly been a death at the hands of Yuppie. And so, through the use of this sort of omniscient narrator, Togashi is able to add another layer of intensity to this battle with the Chimera Ants, which I find incredibly intriguing And it's almost like a breath of fresh air to read to read this to watch this anime, because this is based on the manga, but this is the anime. Because Togashi has all these sort of subtle ways of manipulating the viewer or manipulating the reader that you don't even recognize unless you pay attention to what's going on and you sort of look back and realize in retrospect what's been going on. So Morel's entire struggle, uh, that was with Poof, that was sort of a result of his exhaustion, which led to him being psychologically compromised and him having to confront the tension of the situation even though he's psychologically compromised, was sort of a great undertone to this battle. And the fact that the narrator gives us direct access to Morel's psychological state and therefore expands the scope of his characterization and expands the scope of the storytelling so that we sort of get a better bird's eye view of the struggle between Morel and Poof really adds some intensity to this fight, and not only to this fight in particular, but to the struggle between the hunters and the Chimera ants in general that would not have otherwise been there. Like this extra layer of intensity wouldn't have been there, because if we didn't have the omniscient narrator, we would most likely have identified with Poof. We would have just said, well, Morel made a bad decision. He released Smokey Joe when he shouldn't have. He got schooled by Poof, and that was the end of it. And we probably would have just left it at that. But it was the intervention of that omniscient narrator that allows us a sort of different perspective on this situation. And that adds that extra layer of psychological intensity to this fight. And notice the transition between last week's episode and this week's episode, which again, it doesn't just show you the way that the various ways that Togashi can write a story, but it shows you how smooth his writing is. Because it's one thing to be a sort of a writer who can do a lot of different things. But it's another thing to be a writer who can do a lot of different things and seamlessly transition in one story between those various literary techniques. Because notice the transition from last week's episode to this episode. Last week's episode was what? It was pretty much all about an external physical confrontation between Kahlua being badass and Yuppie. The psychological fight, or the psychological aspects of that fight, was rather subdued in respect to, or as opposed to Kahlua using Kanmuru. But in this fight, the psychological aspects are brought to the forefront and the physical confrontation is in the backdrop. So notice how smooth that transition is between last week's episode and this week's episode. Really two completely different fights, emphasizing two completely different aspects, and yet it's a smooth transition from one to the other. Very nice writing by Togashi. So another great episode with Togashi once again showing why he's at the very least one of the best shonen mangaka around. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.